Wonderful. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Storyforge's Preptober, our first workshop about Save the Cat, which is a scene down breakdown method that will help, make a plot structure that is easy for you to follow. As it says on the project here, it was originally created for screenplays, but can also be really helpful for books. So, Kerrigan, do you want to explain a little bit more about how Save the Cat works?
Yeah. Originally, like you said, it was for screenplays, but I know that there are a lot of authors who like to use it because they're not really sure how to plan or what ways might be beneficial. I know that a lot of people like to keep it simple, especially if they're not usually a planner, just because too much or like too much detail can kind of stress them out. I know I'm that way, but it introduces a concept of a protagonist performing a small action early on to win the audience's sympathy. And I think this template helps because I have friends that use it, and the opening image is supposed to set the story's tone and the main narrative.
Yeah, so a good example of that is instead of having your character wake up in the morning and get dressed and ready for school, unless that's really important, putting your character right into the action.
Yes, especially for a book that's supposed to be heavy in action, because if it's not, that tends to bore readers because there's nothing happening that is actually relevant to the story.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. I know that through all my creative writing classes that I've done as a creative writing major, the amount of times I've seen you wake up in the morning and nothing's different is, you get bored of it. The one time I do suggest that is actually there are a few times. If you're working with a setting where a wake up routine is going to be different, um, for your character. So maybe they live in a fantasy world and breakfast is, I don't know, produced by a machine, right? Your audience should know about that, and that's a good thing. Or the point of having an opening up scene is to show how things slowly change over time. That's another good reason to use it. But typically you want your opening image to be a strong one that definitely is meant to put the reader right into the action.
Yeah. If it's not, it tends to just seem like a filler and that you don't necessarily know what you want to put there. So you're just writing something that's not relevant to start the story.
Yes, I totally agree.
But with Save the Cat, it is a 15-beat sheet that maps out every key turning point of the story. So go through all of them.
Showing the sheet for everybody to see. All right, so we're on to the next one, which is the theme stated, or what it says hinted at, because you never want to just be like, the theme of this story is friendship is important, because that's pretty boring.
It's boring and it gives it away, and at that point, it seems like, well, I already know what's going to happen, or I already know what the moral of the story is, so why am I reading this entire book if I already know what's supposed to happen?
Exactly. This is a good point, this, where your theme is stated. It's also a really good time to set up maybe more so foreshadowing for the theme of the story. So if the theme is friendship, maybe you will have the character describe their friend, or something like, oh, I'm gonna go see my friend, or we've been friends for a long time. And that's a good way to, that's a very brief and probably not the best example, but finding a way to kind of hint at or foreshadow your theme is very important.
Yes, I do believe that foreshadowing is extremely important, especially for people who like to look for those little things and not have it just thrown in their faces.
Yes, it's one of my favorite techniques, foreshadowing. I love to slip it into my stories, and often you are that opening image is very strong, and you're like, wow, look at this super cool sci-fi world. And then that theme is slowly trickled in to the start, the stated time, and like the setup as well.
Right. I definitely agree with that. Moving on to setup, it introduces the main characters, the world that it's in, maybe flaws that the protagonist might have, and its setting itself, which setting is extremely important for a story. It tells you everything you need to know about what's happening and where it's at and the stakes that could possibly happen, because depending on the world that you're in, like if it's magic related, you might have specific spells or creatures that might cause a lot of problems, and the stakes might be higher than something that's just like a romance set in a normal world.
I totally agree. I think like I'm trying to think one of the really good examples of this is in Lord of the Rings. When Frodo sees the what are they?
I
The
would hope, but I've never seen it or I've never read
yeah,
it.
they are they're the guys that were once the humans who held rings of power. And they've like turned into these dark figures on dark horses, and they chase the ring, the one ring. And so because this is when Frodo is, after being introduced, he's leaving the Shire for the first time. And so these basically these uh like minions of Sauron the Dark Lord are coming after him. And it shows this big contrast from the beautiful forest he's walking through to what is actually at stake if he does not get the ring to Rivendell at that time, and then, of course, to um, Mount Doom. So that's a really good example of a very quick, jarring image that helps, introduce the stakes and is sort of a catalyst.
I feel like another reason that setup is really important is like the details that are within the setting, because like if you have a magic world and you don't talk too much about the magic world, people are not really going to understand what the point of it is. I feel like, at least in my opinion, if you have like a magical world and you don't talk about magic or you don't hint at it in some way, later on when you do talk about it, it's kind of like, oh, where did this come from?
Yeah, I completely agree. You're like, what is happening? And there's a like a delicate balance during setup where you can't make it seem very like lore dumpy, where you're just like, this is all happening. But at the same time, you need to make sure you introduce it um, in a way that isn't just very sudden, and you're like, what is happening?
Just right in your face from the get.
Exactly. Yep. I like to, with my story, I like to do my setup as a race because my characters are race car drivers and the cars are different. This is a sci-fi world. So you see like you jump in right as a race is starting and you see kind of the setup of how the race works. And then you actually go into the race. And so that shows you like, okay, this is how setup works. This is what's different instead of just jumping you in with new tech you don't know about. But it's not too lore dumpy because the characters already know what's happening. So they're talking about it like it's normal, without being too confusing.
Right. Race cars. That's actually really interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of a book or writing that involves that.
Yeah, thank you. It's one of my special interests as an ADHD person. I find a way to work it into a lot of my writing.
No, I get that. I've dealt with a lot of like car related things my entire life, so I totally understand.
But speaking of, getting into the story, let's talk about the catalyst. That's that inciting incident that disrupts the normal life. So if we're going to use my story as another example, this is a car crash. Everything goes fine. Usually there's no problem. Suddenly there's a crash. Sometimes your catalyst can be flashy, like a car crash is, but sometimes it is simple, especially if you're writing like slice of life, or realistic fiction. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to be flashy and dramatic. It can be mellow, like a death in the family. Or it can just be you're fired. Maybe something that's part of this character's normal routine is different, and they have to go figure out why it's different. There are a lot of ways to have an interesting catalyst. It all depends on what you're writing.
I believe that both sides of it, whether it's flashy or very like subtle or doesn't seem like as extravagant, are both very important. But it really depends on your story, on which one you need to use, because if you have, a calm, no, like, I don't want to say normal, because to me, no story is ever,
Oh,
well, it's all in the writer and what they choose to write, but something that seems a little bit more casual in a way,
mhm.
if that has like a super flashy, like disruption, it's a little out there, which again, totally up to the author. And if it works, if they do it well, it works. I just know that sometimes it can be a little distracting from the story.
Yeah, I completely agree. Um, I feel like it's important to not overwhelm your reader. So once you've picked like your, if we go back up to theme in your opening image, if you've set the tone as a slice of life, which can be more casual, you don't suddenly want to interrupt with out of nowhere, right? If you've set your tone, and unless that's your intention, which is to subvert the reader's expectations, which if you're doing that, by means, go for it. But if you're not wanting to do that, your catalyst could be something simple. Maybe your character's favorite coffee shop closes down and it changes their view of town, or it makes them meet new people. So that could be a good way to do more of a casual catalyst.
Yeah, I believe, gosh, I think it's the Inheritance games where it goes from like just a normal little life to just being some like extravagant thing, like being thrown into a completely different life, just kind of throws a lot of people off. But I know a lot of people like it. So, I mean, I can't really complain there because I did enjoy it. So it just really depends on the writing itself and how the structure is set up for that, whether it's flashy or it is casual. But that also kind of falls into debate because when they have this disruption, it creates that conflict, and then they have to figure out how they want to react to that and how that's like how they're going to figure out how to navigate their life after all of this happens to them.
Yes, definitely. Um, a lot of the time, this is where you start to see the protagonist. Um, I don't want to say like quote unquote more as a person because obviously there's
Yeah,
humanity in characters already, but this is where you may start to be able to introduce some of those human qualities that we think about in people, like having these internal conflicts. Do you act, or how should you act? So, you know, often putting these debates in front of your character can be very good and can also help move the story forward. Using my story as a quick example, my main character has to decide if he's going to trust the guy he's been trusting for years, who's manipulating him, or a new guy who he doesn't know but currently is not manipulating him. And so that's like a big choice for that character. If we're thinking about the slice of life example I've created, maybe the new character says, well, I have to figure out what coffee shop to go to now. Do I go to Starbucks or do I go to a local place now that my favorite shop has closed? So those conflicts, again, can also reflect what's happening in your story and often do relate to your theme as well.
right. I think that like when they debate on what they have to do, it can really create an interesting part of the story because at times it can leave the readers like, okay, what would happen if they didn't do it this way or if they didn't react this way? What could be different about their life? Or they took a different path, how it could change the entire like story itself. And I think to me as a writer, that's really interesting and also something that is constantly thought about. It's like, oh, if I did this differently, this could change the entire narrative itself.
Oh, definitely. And sometimes I know people who are stuck at the debate and they're having their own debate, which is the right way to go with this story, right? Right? I've done it before too. Sometimes what I do is write a summary or a quick next chapter for both options and see what really fits the character best. Or the plot, depending on how you write stories. I'm a very character-driven writer, but I know people who are very plot-focused. So sometimes you have to have that debate with yourself. And if you are, you probably have a really good debate for your character as well.
100%. I would say yes. I'm also a very character-driven writer. So something that I have done previously is plotting, not necessarily plotting out the whole book, but chapter by chapter. Because if it's spread out more, it's a lot easier to figure out where you might have some plot holes and where you can fix things. And how to figure out the flow of your story and where you want it to go instead of just plotting out like, okay, this is the beginning, this is the middle, this is the end. It gives a little bit more structure, in my opinion.
Oh, I completely agree. I have an outline for my story, which uses a different method than Save the Cat. Although when I start editing, I may replot and Save the Cat because I do quite like this format. And I've strayed from that plot outline a ton. But knowing where to go in the basic idea, is very helpful. So let's talk about the break-in two now, because I think, you can see that these, all lead into each other and are connected. So once they have that internal conflict, deciding what to do, is really where the action and the adventure of the story are starting. For my characters, that's, getting to know someone new, learning things about himself that he never knew. And when he decides to trust someone he's never really trusted before, his world starts to change. And so we see things happening for him after he makes a big decision. So those big decisions can, as I said, also be very small. If we're using the slice of life example, maybe the character decides not to go to Starbucks and go to another local place. Maybe they meet a really nice barista that they become friends with. Or that could be the start of a romance plot. So breaking into is, that fork in the road where you really commit to one outcome
Right.
for the story.
Yeah. And break into two also, I mean, they all lead into each other, but with B story, it's really important to make sure that they're very connected. Because if it's just like kind of a random subplot, then it's not going to add much to their growth as a character or what they might choose to do in the future. It's not going to add too much if they're not super connected.
Yes, I completely agree with that. You want them to be connected, and you want that to make the story feel more grounded.
And then after that is fun and games, where the heart of the story happens. Their successes, their failures, everything that they've debated up into this moment.
Yes, definitely. For my characters, that's falling in love without realizing they're falling in love. There are some nice chill moments as well. For them, going out for dinner or just chilling out. But the protagonist is also facing, his the other person who's been manipulating him. He's also facing other challenges. So I think for fun and games, at least for me, it's great to have a balance between the challenges and the downtime because that allows you to flesh out your characters, sort of in real time, quote unquote. It lets you say, here's my character when they're facing a challenge, but also here's a character when they are resting and how they feel and act differently during that time.
Yeah, the balance between the success and the failure and the challenges is super important because if there's too much of one, whether it's success or failure, for success, it might be, okay, why is this character having so much success? It seems a little unrealistic that they're not being challenged or they're not going through something that would be a little bit difficult for them to do.
Yes, that's also really important. You want to challenge your characters and make them balanced. So then there's the midpoint. It can be a plot twist or an event that raises the stakes and changes the direction of the story. I definitely see a lot of these in writing, and I think they're often really nice if done well. I know that I've seen some plot twists done that sort of like flip the whole script and everyone's like, what is happening? And this makes no sense. So it's really important to make sure that your midpoint change does make sense. This can also be an event. So for me, this is the characters stand up to the main antagonist, which, they had never done before. And so that's sort of the big change. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a plot twist. An event also works very well, but it has to raise the stakes and it has to change the story. Oftentimes, this means disrupting the protagonist's plans, or maybe they happen, but they don't go the way that the antagonist or the protagonist wanted.
Yeah, with it could be something big, it could be something small. I know, like in my story, it's something as small as an old friend, but even something as small as an old friend can change the entire, like, direction of the story because of what happens with said character. It's really important to make sure that it flows nicely and that it's not just thrown out there.
Yep, that's also really important. You want your reader to be able to see that a change is happening, and oftentimes that comes with the bad guys closing in. Maybe the bad guys aren't people in my story. It is. There is very much tension as the antagonist tries to find where the protagonist is kind of hiding out. But sometimes the bad guys are like the demons in the characters' heads. Maybe they have an anxiety and they act on that anxiety instead of their gut, and that changes their relationship with a person in the story. So I think it's really important to consider both those, as it says here, internally and externally, what opposition, what obstacles are there. Things will go wrong here, and it's okay for them to go wrong here. Because you want to see how your characters are going to maneuver those obstacles.
Yes, I really love seeing. I know some people only choose to do the opposition externally, but I really enjoy seeing how their characters are reacting to it, especially if it's like, let's say, a romance and something between them happens. It's nice to see how their characters will react to that because it kind of gives them a more human feel to them. It's like, okay, well, we feel these emotions. So it's nice to be able to put it into a character where things obviously go wrong, which leads into all is lost, where it's the darkest moment, which, like I said before, if it's a romance and let's say they break up or whatever it might be, for them, for that character, that would be their darkest moment where it would feel like they have lost everything.
Yep, that's, going into All is Lost. I think it is really important for characters to have that moment. Because a lot of the times the bad guys closing in is internal. And it does sort of create a moment where, everything feels lost. Um, for my character, that's literally having the antagonist find him and try and kidnap him. So that is actually a very like, oh no, we're really in trouble and something as bad is going to happen. But that could, for a simpler story or a different story, I should say, could be a big anxiety attack or a depressive episode that changes how your character views the world, or, what makes them comfortable. So those moments are, really important for showing your reader the ups and downs of a character's life or story.
Yeah, and Dark Night of the Soul, the protagonist hitting that rock bottom and having to reflect, it obviously builds that character, and like I said before, it gives them a more human feel because we can relate to it if it's something like relationships, or even if it's not, we can find little bits and pieces of it that we do relate to, of finding or experiencing that self-doubt before being able to move on from it and figure out how you want to go about doing these things that could potentially make you a better person.
Definitely. I know for my story, the Dark Night of the Soul and All Is Lost, along with the Break into Three, are all sort of one scene, but you can always break them up. So that scene is the main character running away in a car, and literally being like, I'm gonna get kidnapped if I don't get away. Um, and that Break into Three is when he realizes that he no longer needs to be under the control of this antagonist. And he's in the middle of literally the darkest night, as he is driving and realizes that he doesn't need anybody to tell him who he is. And so for that Break into Three, you want to find that inspiring realization, or that solution, or both. It doesn't necessarily have to be big and flashy. Sometimes that moment of realization is, I have friends, for the first time in a while, or wow, I really feel comfortable in this place. And those are all great things to have your Break into Three.
Yes, the inspiring realization is very important. I mean, everything in a story is important. Every little bit and piece has, a part in the story. But the solution is kind of where a lot of people are like, okay, I'm really starting to figure out what the point of the story was, where I figure out what the moral of the story was or what the theme was, because they go back and they're like, okay, well, this was the conflict that was here. This is how they solved it. And then it goes into the finale, which is where I don't want to say main part, but it's the climax where they confront those conflicts and they figure out like their solution to win.
Yes. And again, this is an important point for where all your storylines converge. So if you have that subplot started, you need to make sure that that also converges at the climax. For my character, that's running the antagonist into a ditch during that car chase. So for my story, they're very close together, but not all of them are. This could be a confrontation, very literally, of a bully, or a parent, or even a situation. Maybe a character's had a family member pass away and they haven't really been able to grieve, and they finally let themselves grieve by visiting their grave or some other memorial to them. So you want to find that punch, even if that punch is much more simple than big cool car chase.
Yeah, I know. I've read a couple stories where you throughout the story you see subplots and you obviously take note of those things, and then at the end of it they don't come together, and it's just kind of like, oh, well, whatever happened to this thing, or whatever, like, why did this not go anywhere? Why did this not finish? Why did this not end?
Yes, I think having your storylines finish or converge is super, super important. Because I know some people who write stories where there are like different plot lines that they might not necessarily all connect at the same time, but by the finale, you want everything to have connected at this point. You want to see everything come to a close. And that's why you have that final image. As it says, final. This is a mirror of the opening image, because you want to see how the protagonist has changed. So, for example, if you are doing a waking up in the morning scene, which, I only recommend for certain situations, you would show how their morning routine is different. For my slice of life example, maybe the character it goes to the new coffee shop that they finally have been trying out. And instead of sitting alone like they used to, they sit with new friends and everything feels different. Um, my novel does not technically have a final image yet because I haven't gotten there, but currently it's planned to be a demolition derby, and is very different from the crash in the beginning scene, where destruction is bad. This is where destruction is good, because in a demolition derby, the point is destruction, and it's all for a fundraiser. So it's really important to balance it with your opening image, even if they're not exactly the same. The vibes and the concepts should be.
I think it's so. I just want to point out it's so interesting, and I love that you are doing a story with race cars and cars because, like, demolition derbies, that has been a part of my life for so many years. That it's like I've never seen that. So for, and it would only maybe relate to, it would be interesting for a lot of people, but there would be a small community of people who would relate to that and be like, okay, this was actually part of my life. And I never see anybody talk about this because it may not be as popular, but this makes me feel seen in a way.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And the point of the demo is to take the main antagonist's car and ruin it. A lot of people love to destroy something from their ex or someone they don't like. So even though a smaller group of people will say, yes, demos were a part of my life, most people will still relate to that destruction. Some people, delete pictures of their ex or they burn letters, things like that. So that's what that's meant to represent.
yes, as well as like how their world has changed. It could be, as we've said so many times before, could be something flashy or it could be something small and bittersweet, like you said, with the coffee shop, with sitting with new friends instead of being alone, or, you know, going from like the inheritance games. Like, I'll mention it again because it's one of the only examples I can think of right now, is where you started out from the beginning with how she was with her family, and then at the very end it's like a totally different lifestyle change, and it's just so interesting, and it's how
Yeah,
it makes it look personalized or very personal and not just generic like every other book.
definitely. And if you're writing a series, your final image might also want to hint at something that's going to happen in the next book. Um, but sometimes your final image is it. That's it. That's the story's done, and you want to close it there. I also find prologues can be or this would be epilogues, excuse me, are a great way to boost that final image if you need it. So maybe your final image is very celebratory, but there's something you haven't had a chance to cover. An epilogue can be great to do that if you think you need it. It's definitely not required, but I definitely use prologues and epilogues to give just enough to not feel like I'm adding a whole new chapter to the story, but just enough information to tie up any other like loose ends.
I feel like that would also go very well for series, because I know a lot of readers do not like when authors leave everything on a cliffhanger and then they have to wait for that next book in the series because they're like, why would they do this?
Yes, exactly. So leaving your cliffhangers in uh, an epilogue are a great way to prevent them like from the story, prevent the story from feeling unfinished.
Yes, because if it's at the very ending and there's like no epilogue, it just seems very full stop and very very unfinished, like you said. But an epilogue gives the last little bit that's needed to make it seem a little bit more complete, even if it is part of a series.
Yep. And, epilogues are not required, but they can be helpful sometimes. So that is the entire sheet here. Um,
Only 15
and
steps.
only nice and simple. Um, Obviously, these boxes are, somewhat small. So if you're the kind of person who likes to write a bigger thing, you absolutely can do this. But does anyone have any questions? I know some people have joined late. Hello to everyone who's joined late. If you have any questions, let's open up for discussion. You can also leave them in the chat if you don't want to talk.
That too. I will say, Save the Cat is available on the Storyforge website in the writing resources.
So this template, we have a question in the chat. This is, wait, this costs money. This template that is on the screen costs money. I think because of Preptober, it's 75 cents, correct?
Yes.
Yes. However, Save the Cat is a method that many people have used for a long time. So the method itself does not cost any money.
Just the template if you chose to go to the Storyforge website and purchase it if you wanted to have this exact template. But like you said, it's a very open method, so a lot of people use it. So you could make your own template or you could find one, but I'm a little bit biased.
I do love this beautiful template. It's very nice. So if you want this template, you can absolutely go and purchase it. The money goes to supporting the platform and development. So you have a question between transitioning between segments. So yeah, do you want to elaborate a little more, or are you just in general curious about how you would go between each segment? So making them feel seamless. Yes, that is definitely a good question. So the big fight in a conversation. Yeah, okay, that's a good example to work with. So oftentimes, if you're going from a big fight to a conversation, sometimes I use a chapter break, because a chapter break helps you show that things have changed. So if there's a big fight happening, and somebody wins or loses, that's it. That chapter's done. And then you change into a scene that's a lot calmer, and then those characters are having a conversation. However, sometimes a big fight can beat one character down so much that they give in and start talking and communicating. So, like for that example, there are a lot of ways to make those scenes transition. It basically entirely depends on your story and what your story needs.
I will add that a very good way to make things feel seamless is to put a lot of sensory input on the scenes more than just narration itself, and kind of like be in the mind of the character, for example, or like kind of like see the surroundings. And if it's like what Rosetta was saying, a character feeling like beating down and they start talking eventually, like what are they seeing, what are they feeling, what are they smelling, like feeling as in like texture, not only emotionally or psychologically, using sensory descriptions and in general the environment to transition one very pivotal moment to the other one are ways in which people can just be so immersed in the story that they don't realize that something is transitioning until it happens. And the same thing can be done with things that are just like a transition in between chapters. And if you need to like have a chapter in between that is more of like a moment in which, I don't know, the people are not talking, for example, but there's still some tension going on, to using those descriptions, or maybe if it's not in the same situation, dialogue with other characters that can describe a little bit more what is going on in their lives, the consequences of the first thing that eventually will build up on the second thing, are probably good ways to go as well.
I would say, along with what they were saying, with sensory descriptions are easy and it might seem like aimless rambling. I do agree. It's hard to find that balance at first, but I think adding, like with the dialogue or something to, is not as long as it's not super long or it doesn't seem pointless, like if it has a point to the story, it's a lot better than just changing it right away. If that makes sense. Any other questions or opinions?
Oh, yeah, I have a question. I don't this is like the first time I'm actually sitting down to like fully write stuff, so I have a million notes from everything you guys have been saying. Honestly, stories make a lot more sense after hearing you guys talk about this. I understand a little bit more about where things are supposed to go. These are like intended to be like, I guess to start like you're like one sentence, right? Like, this is the opening image. Boom. This is like I'm at a coffee shop, right? And then the theme stated, my theme is friendship. And then the setup is like, my character is a barista or something, right? And then you come back later and like you're writing more and more. But like I'm just trying to figure out where to start. Like, am I just supposed to like start like writing like a sentence about like what the catalyst is, and then maybe if I'm like inspired, I'll write like a couple, and that's like the main thing that I'm like working off of. Is that how this works?
On the template itself, I believe it says at the top 1 to 2 sentences, just so you have an idea of what you're putting in for each section. And then when you go back to write said scene, you can add in as much detail as you may want or need with it. I think it's just so you don't overwhelm yourself with too much at a time, that you're able to just put in a couple sentences and then go back later.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. It was going to add to that. So the best kind of, because what I did when I first tried to use a template was that I wrote out 5-6 sentences about the scene. And by then, there was just too much information. So this template and other templates, basically they want you to get to the meat of it, right? Or to the bones, I guess. Get to it. The core of what makes this scene important. So for your opening image, you would say, a nice coffee shop in the middle of town. That kind of thing. And so you want the story to, come to life when you write it, not in your planning. So think about this as the bones, and then the writing is the meat of your, I like to sometimes call them story skeletons. You're going to put the meat on the bones of your story skeleton, and then you're going to flesh it out. So once you have this template filled out, you can go start writing your story. And you can, now that you've got your opening image kind of generalized, you can say, okay, well, how does this coffee shop look? So when you're actually writing your story, then you can write, the coffee shop is in a nice corner of the town. You don't hear many cars passing by. There is a sign in the window that flashes, open. Sometimes it's, sometimes it doesn't flicker in time, etc., etc. That's when you put that detail in. So for your template or your basic breakdown, you want 1 to 2 sentences. That's plenty.
Okay. And like a second follow-up like question. Each like section can just be whatever length, right? Like these aren't like supposed to be like, yes, this is like I'm imagining like just a hypothetical 15 chapter book, and like each chapter is each specific thing, but you can make them however long you want, as long as it's not like, droning on forever about a specific thing.
Yes. So I'm gonna go back down to these like the bad guys closing in, all is lost, Dark Knight, and Break Into 3. For me, this is about 2 chapters. So all is lost. So basically, the bad guy's closing in. My character is about to be kidnapped. Bad guy's in his house. That's bad. He leaves, right? He runs away with his friend. And so this is still in the same chapter that he gets in the car and starts to run away. Everything feels lost. We're still in the same chapter. And then the Dark Knight is just dry where they're being chased. And the character's like, I've, screwed this up. we're both gonna get hurt by this guy who's been manipulating me my whole life if I, if I don't do something. And then his the secondary character's like, you can do something. You're not as weak as you feel you are. And that moment of inspiration happens in the car. And this is still one chapter. The climax happens in that chapter where the main character drives the antagonist into a ditch. Obviously there are more parts of the climax that aren't in that chapter. They happen afterwards. But those are very interconnected. These are very interconnected in my story. Now, not every story has to be that way. But so yes, the Sky Crystal in the chat is saying that there are different percentages per beat. And that is honestly going to depend on your story. It really depends on what you're writing, how much you want to put in, etc.
Yes, I will say that it really depends on the author themselves and how much they want to include in their detail or other things they might want to put in that would make it a little bit more lengthy than some other stories or other sections of the book.
Okay, thanks. That was very helpful.
Yeah, did we have any more questions before we wrap up? If you're watching the recording of this, you can always leave, questions in the comments so other people can help out, or, if we have a chance, we can always answer them as well. We love hearing your comments. All right, if we have no more questions, then thank you so much for coming to the first workshop of Preptober.